What if I told you the first night Eve ever spent outside the garden was also the night she remembered every tree by name? What if exile was not punishment, but memory returning to the body? The wind had no path that night. The stars refused to speak. And the moon, older than Eden itself, hovered like a question no one dared answer. What did the garden smell like once it was behind her? What did the ground sound like when it no longer breathed God's breath? Close your eyes. When you subscribe, you carry forward a memory heaven tried to erase. The night was not cold, but the air carried a weight, as if every breath Eve took was no longer shared with heaven. The soil beneath her toes, once soft and humming with sacred pulses, now felt still. Not dead, just hesitant, and above her the trees swayed without sound. Their branches did not greet her. Their leaves did not whisper. The garden had become a stranger, and yet it remembered her. The boundary was invisible. No wall, no gate, but she felt it like a silence wrapped in skin. Where once the wind had danced with her hair, now it hovered uncertain, unwilling. What does it mean when even the air no longer moves to meet you? Can you be alive and already a ghost in the place you called home? Adam stood behind her, close but not close enough to reach. His hand did not touch her shoulder, and she did not ask it to. They were both waiting for something neither of them knew how to name. Was it judgment? Was it farewell? Or was it simply the slow unfurling of a goodbye that had already begun? The garden was breathing slower now. The flowers had closed early, hiding their faces from the stars. The birds no longer sang. Even the insects, once a gentle chorus of twilight, had fallen mute. The world knew what was coming, but no one, not even the angels, knew what came after. Eve stepped forward, but her foot would not pass. There was no flame, no sword, no voice, just a stillness, a knowing. And sorrow. What if the garden itself was holding its breath? What if Eden, for one final night, was asking her to stay? She turned her head slightly, just enough to see the river, just enough to remember its laughter, just enough to wonder if it too had learned the sound of weeping. There had been no thunder, no storm, just a question spoken by a voice that once called stars by name, a question that now echoed like a bell buried in soft earth. Where are you? It had not been asked in anger. And yet it unraveled her. She had not answered with defiance, only with breath, only with trembling, only with a fig leaf pressed against a heart that no longer beats in harmony with the trees. Now that same heart pressed against her ribs like a child asking to be born again. Why do we only recognize paradise when we are leaving it? Why do the edges of sacred things become clear only when we can no longer touch them? She took another step, not forward but inward, into memory, into the soft ash of before. The place inside her that still carried the scent of untouched fruit, the laughter of animals that had never feared the night, the voice that once walked beside her as easily as breath. The sky above did not darken, it simply dimmed, as though even light itself was softening for her departure. And still the wind would not move. It stood like an angel without wings, aching to reach her, forbidden to pass. Had the breath of God told it to halt? Had it wept when it learned it could not follow her into the dust? Behind her, Adam finally moved, but the earth did not. Eve did not cry, not yet. Her tears belonged to a future that had not been written. But in that moment, on the edge of the world's first sorrow, she whispered something only the garden heard. It was not an apology. It was not a regret. It was a name, one no longer spoken by angels, one not yet known to mortals, one born between bone and memory. And the garden shivered, the fig tree leaned ever so slightly toward her shadow. The river paused, and the wind for the briefest moment tried to follow her, but it could not. She stepped beyond the silence, and Eden exhaled. The moment her foot touched the soil beyond, the ground seemed to recoil, not in anger but in uncertainty. It had never known her. This earth, outside the garden's breath, was ancient in a different way. It bore no memory of creation's joy. It had never been spoken over by the voice. It had never been kissed by the feet of angels. It had only known waiting, and now her. What does the ground feel when it is touched for the first time by one who remembers heaven? Can dirt mourn? Can it be hoped for? Eve felt the ache in her soles, a new texture, grit that did not sing. The silence here was deeper, heavier. It did not listen. It did not respond. I only watched it. Behind her, the trees remained still. The garden had closed its eyes, not in rejection, but in mercy. And then the wind turned back. Not harshly, not with disdain. It lingered for a moment, as if hoping she would change her mind. As if hoping the story could still fold backward like parchment warmed by prayer. But she did not turn. And so the wind, obedient to a command not spoken aloud, vanished into the branches and was gone. What happens to the wind that is denied? Does it become a memory? Or does it sleep inside the leaves, waiting to be sung again? Adam stepped beside her, his silence louder than any voice. His shadow trembled. He looked not at her but at the distance, the endless plain ahead, dry and wide and unpromised. This was not punishment, not entirely. This was something else. A page turned, a breath held. A test of whether love could remember its own origin after forgetting the sound of God's footsteps. Eve's hand found her chest. She could not feel the voice anymore, but she could feel the echo, a pulse, a rhythm older than pain. She looked at Adam, and for the first time she saw him without light. No glow. No garden behind him. No promise between them. Only exile. Only this body. This breath. This is now. What if love is what remains after all the sacred things have left? What if we only begin to choose each other after paradise has closed its gate? They walked together, not toward anything, but away from everything. The sky above them watched in silence. No stars, just mist, just waiting. Eve glanced one last time over her shoulder. The trees no longer moved. The flowers had bowed their heads. And somewhere within the garden, a vine that once wrapped itself around her wrist like a laughing child curled inward and wilted. Could plants feel abandonment? Could beauty bruise? She would never know, because the gate, though unseen, had sealed behind her. And ahead, nothing but dust. Yet somewhere, buried deep beneath that dust, the bones of future gardens stirred, as if remembering her footsteps before they were ever planted. She would build again, not Eden, but something sacred enough for sorrow. The dust ahead was not shaped for her, but it parted beneath her weight like a reluctant servant. With each step, the world learned her name. The wild grasses bent, not in welcome, but in recognition. They had never been touched by a hand that remembered the sound of creation. Eve did not speak. Her voice belonged to a time when speaking was communion, not confession. Now her silence did the speaking, and silence has a weight the earth understands. What stories does the dirt carry beneath its silence? What seeds lie buried that remember the touch of heaven's breath? The horizon stretched wide, and the stars began to blink into being, hesitant and scattered. These were not the stars that hovered over Eden. These were watchers from afar, distant, unnamed. And Eve wondered, were they always there beyond the garden's glow, or had exile revealed what holiness once shielded? She stepped across a small stone. Beneath it the ground shifted, a brittle crack faint like the memory of a language no longer spoken. She paused. There in the stillness something moved. A breeze, faint. Not Eden's wind. This one was colder, curious. It circled her once and carried her scent across the barren stretch ahead, then vanished into the unknown. Would another creature breathe that scent in the dark and know that one who had walked with the voice had passed by? Adam said nothing. His hands were clenched. His shadow was longer now. It merged with hers, indistinguishable from the dust. They were no longer man and woman of the garden. They were now dust and breath stitched together in exile. And still, Eve did not cry. There was a strength in her that came not from defiance but from remembering. She carried the memory of rivers that ran without fear. She carried the echo of fruit that had never rotted. She carried the sacred hush of early morning when the dew glistened and God called her beloved without using words. Could memory be a shield? Could it be the garment fig leaves could never become? Her feet were sore now. The path ahead was uneven, filled with roots that had no name, stones that had no story. Yet each one seemed to whisper as she passed, not in greeting but in question. Who are you, woman of breath and silence? What did you see when heaven closed its eyes? And why do your footsteps carry sorrow like a crown? The sky turned violet, not the violet of peace. The violet of ache, of something vast folding in on itself. The color of wounds that had not yet learned to bleed. Eve stopped again, not from weariness, but because she heard something. A sound she hadn't known outside the garden. It was not windy, not voice. It was the breath of the world beginning to weep. She placed her palm upon the earth. It was warm, alive, but uncertain. As if asking her, "Are you the one we were warned about?" She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, and the darkness beneath her eyelids felt like the first night of creation before light was spoken. She remembered the garden, not as a place, but as a presence, a S. Sent a breath, a hush, and she carried it within her, not because she chose to, but because she had no choice. Some memories are not memories, they are bones, and bones do not forget. The first night beyond the garden had no beginning. It simply arrived slow and solemn, like a veil falling over something sacred. Darkness was no longer layered with divine warmth. It was full now, honest, hollow, a darkness that had never heard the voice. Eve's breath slowed, her shoulders ached, not from burden, but from the sudden absence of light. What happens to a body that once walked in radiance when it must now learn the weight of shadow? She sat, knees folded to chest, arms wrapped around the ache of her own presence. And beside her, Adam finally knelt, not as protector, not as husband, not as flesh of her flesh, but as a man who no longer knew the names of the trees. They said nothing, because what could be said? They had once walked among beasts who bowed to no one but still loved. They had once eaten without guilt, touched without fear, slept without sorrow. Now even the silence seemed too loud. Above them the stars had multiplied, thousands now, millions. Where had they been before, or had Eden's light hidden them? Had the garden's holiness made the heavens small, or was it only in exile that the vastness of the world was revealed? Eve tilted her head toward the sky. The constellations meant nothing to her yet. They were not maps, not signs. Just scattered embers in a story she had not been told. She did not wish to return, not because she was angry, but because returning was impossible. Even if she crossed back, she would bring the dust with her. The memory of what she now knew could not be unwound. And maybe that was the deeper exile, not being cast out, but being awakened. And in awakening, losing innocence like a garment, folded and left behind at the edge of paradise. A breeze moved again. This one is colder than before. From it came no scent, no whisper, only a question that moved across her skin like water through ash. Will you remember when no one else does? Will you carry the garden when even your children forget? Adam looked at her. My eyes are tired, face soft with sorrow. He reached for her hand and she let him, not as comfortable, but as a covenant, two exile, two fragments of breath stitched from dust and will. And beneath their hands the earth pulsed once faint, like a drum beneath miles of stone. Eve placed her other hand on her belly. She felt nothing yet, but something had already begun, a memory wrapped in flesh, a seed that would grow roots far from the river she once bathed in. And she whispered so softly the ground alone could hear, "I will not forget." She did not speak of the fruit, she did not speak of the serpent, she did not speak of the voice, only of the leaves, the light, the laughter, the garden's breath, and the ache of its absence. The stars dimmed again, as if honoring her vow. And somewhere beyond the veil of wind and memory, the garden wept. Sleep did not come, not because her body resisted rest, but because rest, like joy, now lived behind her. In the garden, sleep had been a breath, a sacred pause, a descent into the warmth of divine rhythm. Now it was something her body had to seek, not something given. Eve lay on the earth. It was uneven, unfamiliar. There were no vines to cradle her, no perfume of lilies blooming under starlight, just dust. And the quiet rustle of a world learning how to exist without God walking its center. How long does it take for peace to forget its shape? The stars above stretched endlessly, their vastness pressed against her skin. She felt small not in fear, but in awareness. In Eden, everything had fit inside her heart. Out here, the world was larger than her memory, wider than her longing. She turned her face into the crook of her arm. She remembered the tree she loved most. not the one that brought the voice of the serpent, but the one whose leaves caught the morning light like golden fire. She had named it in a language no longer spoken. She had sung beneath it, slept in its shade, laughed with birds that nested in its arms. Would it remember her? Would it lean toward the garden's gate, hoping to hear her footsteps return? Or would it bloom without her and forget? Adam slept beside her. His breath was shallow, uncertain, like a man who dreams of things he cannot undo. She did not wake him, not because he needed rest, but because she needed to remember alone. There was holiness in solitude, and tonight she was holy in exile. The wind had not returned, the air was still, not even insects stirred. As if the world had paused to listen to the silence she carried, Eve reached for a small stone, warmed from the day's sun, now cooling under night's breath. She pressed it to her chest, a crude reminder of the garden's warmth. She whispered again, this time not a name, but a question, soft, ancient, unanswered. Will you ever LK with me again? The wind did not reply, but the stars, once distant, once cold, began to shimmer with the faintest pulse, as if some part of heaven had heard, as if memory, even exiled, could still echo beyond the veil. And in that moment, lying in dust, wrapped in sorrow, crowned in silence, Eve did not feel lost. She felt chosen, not for suffering, but for remembering. And in the stillness that stretched around her, as if the world was waiting for her to speak again. The garden's final breath passed through her lungs and stayed. Before there was shame, there was skin, unhidden, unmarred, unknown to fear. The body was not a secret then, it was a hymn, a temple shaped by breath. And when Adam looked at Eve in those early days, he did not see a woman, he saw a reflection of the moment God had paused and called dust holy. But now her skin felt foreign, not just to Adam, to herself. Her hands trembled when they touched her own form, not from sin, not from guilt. From a distance, as if the body had slipped out of innocence and into something the trees no longer recognized. Is it possible to be naked in the eyes of God and not be ashamed until you see yourself through your own eyes? The fig leaves were not chosen for comfort. They were chosen because they were close, broad, thick, quick to tear and quicker to cover. But even as she fastened them, as Adam's eyes turned from her out of reverence or fear, she could feel the leaves resisting, not in defiance, in grief. As if the tree that bore them remembered her laughter from days before and mourned what she now believed herself to be. Do plants feel lost when their gifts are used to hide what once walked in glory? Do leaves dream of falling for joy, not for shame? She wrapped the first leaf around her chest. It crumpled slightly, not from dryness, from sorrow. The second leaf pressed against her side like a child clinging to a mother's gown, and still she tied it, bound it, shaped it into modesty. But modesty had not yet been invented, only memory clothed in fear. Adam struggled with his own leaves. His hands were strong but not precise. They had never had to create before, never had to hide. And in his fumbling, Eve saw something that shook her. He was beautiful, even in shame, even in exile. He was still made in the image of the breath they once walked with. What if love, true love, is not the celebration of light, but the decision to see beauty even when the light has gone? She reached for a final leaf. It was darker than the rest, older. It had fallen on its own. She pressed it gently to her belly. The skin there felt sacred, not because of what had happened, but because of what would one day come. The promise had not been spoken yet, but the ache had begun. And as she fastened the final tie, the wind, the one from within Eden, stirred once more. It did not enter, but I watched it, and in its stillness Eve knew. The fig tree had remembered her. And it had given its leaves in mourning, not for what she had done, but for what had been lost. She had never sown before, not with hands, not with grief, not with trembling fingers guided by silence. Her knowledge was instinct now, or perhaps memory older than her own. A knowing that came from somewhere beyond her breath, whispered from the dust that first held her shape. The leaves were wet when she first touched them, not from dew, from tears the tree itself had shed. How does a tree mourn its own offering? Eve wove them together with strands of vine, twisting them slowly. She moved with reverence as though each motion might be recorded by the earth. And perhaps it was. The soil had eyes even if it had no voice. Adam worked beside her, shoulders hunched, his silence stretching like an unseen canopy above them. He did not look at her, but she could feel him remembering. What was he remembering? Her laughter as she ran through the river with dragonflies swirling, the sound of her voice when she named the first blossom she ever held, or the moment their eyes met and no veil stood between them. Now there was a veil, a green veil of leaves, and beneath it, shame grew like roots in rain. When did nakedness become a burden? Not at the moment of biting. No, that moment had been fire, not fear. It was the moment after, when the voice did not come walking, when the hush fell over Eden like a second skin, when the trees turned away. What if shame is not born of sin, but of silence? Eve held one leaf up to the light. It glowed faintly, its veins pulsing with the memory of sunlight. It had known her before the hiding. It had covered nothing once, and in that nothingness there had been no guilt. Now it covers everything, and still it was not enough. She fastened it to the others and pulled the makeshift garment around herself. It scratched, it clung, it resisted, not because it was poorly made, but because it was never meant to be worn. Some things, once sacred, suffer when asked to become. Armor. Adam finally spoke, only a whisper. I couldn't find enough. Eve looked at him. His covering was loose, uneven. His hands were scratched from climbing. The leaves he had chosen were smaller, torn at the edges. She said nothing, because what could be said between two who had seen each other without the veil and now saw each other through the eyes of exile? They were covered now, but not protected, only hidden. The fig leaves rustled in the soft wind that circled them. And somewhere far behind them, deep within the center of Eden, the fig tree sighed. The first time Eve tried to walk in the leaves, her steps faltered. They clung to her thighs, pulled at her knees. The vines tightened with movement, as though unsure if they were meant to hold or let go. She had run barefoot through rivers once, climbed trees with laughter in her lungs, spun beneath branches until the world blurred and joy poured from her eyes like rain. Now even her gait had changed. Each step was hesitant, not out of fear, but unfamiliarity, as if her own body were a stranger learning to carry itself through silence. What does it mean when the body forgets how to be free? Adam reached out to steady her. His hand hovered, then withdrew. She felt the absence more than the intention. There was a time when his touch had no weight, no need for permission. Now even kindness felt fragile. They walked slowly, side by side, past the tree whose shadow still leaned toward the memory of their presence, past the place where the serpent had once curled itself around questions, past the hush where birds had forgotten how to sing. The leaves rustled against their skin, soft but never silent, and Eve began to wonder, were they whispering, not to her, to each other? Had the fig leaves, torn from their home, woven into grief, begun to speak among themselves? She was once dressed in the mourning. Now she wears us. Do we honor her or bury her? It was a foolish thought, perhaps, but in exile even the foolish become sacred. She reached down to adjust a loosened tie. Her fingers brushed a bruise forming on her hip from nothing more than walking through branches that had never once harmed her before. Was the pain her fault, or the land, or was this simply the weight of knowing? She straightened and looked ahead. The garden was dim behind them now, still glowing faintly, still watching. Would it remember her as she was? Or only as she became? Adam's voice came again, barely audible. I don't like how it feels. Eve did not answer. She didn't like it either, but she wore it anyway, because memory too can be worn, and perhaps it must be. Her hands rested at her sides, clutching the corners of her garment as if holding back more than fabric. She was not hiding from God. She was hiding from herself, and from a world that would one day name her wrong. The leaves shifted in the wind, and for a breathless second the air smelled like before. Like jasmine, like fresh water, like laughter. Then it was gone, and in its place only dust and fig leaves that knew far too much. That night, when the stars no longer watched and the moon dimmed her gaze, Eve sat beneath a tree far beyond Eden's breath. The fig leaves wrapped around her like a whisper too proud to ask for comfort. They clung, not out of need but out of mourning. She ran her fingers over their edges. Soft, worn, some had begun to wilt. Already life was fading from them. What happens to a covering when it forgets the one who wore it with light? What does it become when it carries shame instead of sunlight? Adam lay a few paces away, curled inward, his back to her. His leaves had torn in the night. A vine snapped while he turned. He didn't fix it. He hadn't the heart. Eve watched him, and something inside her ached, not for the garden, but for the man who once smiled at her like the stars had carved his joy. That man had not returned from the garden. This one, this quiet one, wrapped in sorrow, was born in exile. Was she? The fig leaves, now creased and bruised, no longer offered modesty. They offered memories. They were the first altar she had ever built, woven not of stone, but of grief and hands too tender to forget. She held one of the loose leaves up to the firelight. It curled slightly in the heat, the veins glowing gold for just a moment, like it remembered. She pressed it to her lips and kissed it, not in worship, in farewell. She untied the vines around her waist slowly, reverently. Each knot has a name, each loop is letting go. The leaves fell gently into her lap, tired, softened, willing. She placed them beside her in the dust, and for the first time since exile began, she let the wind touch her skin again. It was not the wind of Eden. It was harsher, drier, but it was honest. And honesty, though cruel, is a kind of holiness. Adam stirred, turned toward her. His eyes opened, and for the first time since they covered themselves, they saw each other, truly, not through shame, not through memory, but through breath. Fragile, sacred, unhidden, he reached for her hand. She did not pull away. The fig leaves lay between them, cradled in dust and firelight, no longer garments but witnesses. And when the wind passed again, slower now, almost kind, it rustled through them gently, as if to say, "You are remembered, even in exile." By morning the leaves had turned. What had once been green with memory was now dulled, brittle at the edges. Their softness had been spent in silence. Their strength offered in sorrow was fading with the night. Eve gathered them carefully, not to wear but to bury. She did not speak as she moved. Her fingers folded each leaf as gently as if closing the eyes of something once alive. She placed them in a shallow patch of earth near a crooked stone, pressed them into the soil, and covered them with dust and breath. The first burial, not of flesh, but of innocence. And the ground accepted them, not with joy, but with reverence. What is buried when memory is laid to rest? Do fig leaves dream of returning to the tree? Adam watched her from a distance. He did not interrupt. He felt it too, the weight of what had passed through their hands, what had touched their skin, what had shielded their sorrow like a silent witness. And now that witness is gone. Eve wiped her hands on her thighs, leaving streaks of earth. Her skin bore no wound, but she felt as though something had been cut from her, something unseen, sacred, surrendered. She turned toward the rising sun. It looks different now, too wide, too much to watch. In the garden, light had wrapped around her like a song. Out here it is observed, it cast shadows, it revealed everything. And still she did not cover herself. She stood before the light, not with pride, but with promise. If God would not walk beside her, then memory would. If Eden was closed, then her breath would carry its name. If shame had tried to cover her, then she would uncover the truth with every step forward. That holiness was not lost in exile. It had only learned to walk in dust. Beside her, Adam approached slowly. He carried a stone in his hand, smooth, white, etched by time. He placed it gently atop the patch of buried leaves, a marker, a sign. And in that act, something ancient awakened, not in heaven, not in Eden, but in the soil, a vow that even what has been hidden in shame may one day rise in glory. Eve knelt, whispered nothing. And the wind, though faint, though different, passed through her hair and did not turn away. It did not happen all at once. The garden did not vanish like smoke. It lingered, it breathed, and then it slowly exhaled. Its final breath was not a storm, it was not thunder or fire. It was a soft release, like the last sigh of a dream before waking. The vines curled inward. The flowers closed their eyes. The trees bowed not in death but in reverence. What does a sacred place do when no one walks it anymore? Does holiness grieve in silence? Does Eden weep when it no longer remembers who it was planted for? Far beyond the gate, Eve felt it not with her body but with something older than flesh. A pull behind the ribs, a flutter in the breath. The way one senses the moment a candle goes out, even in another room. She looked back even though she couldn't see the garden anymore, not with her eyes, but with the place in her soul still wet with dew. There was a sound faint, fragile, the trembling hush of leaves kissing one another goodbye. And behind that a silence deeper than sorrow. The garden was closing, not with wrath, with love, because love too must sometimes let go. Above it the sky dimmed, not in mourning but in respect. Light bent around Eden's edges as though shielding its secrets one last time. And still the voice did not return, not to stop it, not to comfort, not even to speak farewell. Was this the cost of choice? Or was this the promise of it? Eve's knees gave way. She knelt in the dust, not to pray, not to plead, but to listen. And in the quiet she heard it, the breath, not wind, not voice, just a breath, the garden's last. It carried the scent of every bloom, the laughter of animals that had never feared, the hush of rivers untouched by blood. It moved through the trees one final time, touching every leaf, every petal, every root. And then it passed beyond the veil. It reached her. It found her. It circled her once and vanished. What if the first thing that ever loved you is the last thing to say goodbye? She bowed her head, and the dust beneath her warmed for a moment, as if the garden, even in its fading, remembered her name. Adam stood some distance away, still as stone, watching the horizon. He did not kneel, not because he did not feel it, but because he feared that if he bowed, he might not rise again. The garden's breath had touched him too. It had passed through his chest like the ghost of a song he once sang but could no longer recall. It filled his lungs with the ache of beginnings. He placed his hand over his heart, not in reverence but in memory. There had been a tree deep within Eden whose bark bore the imprint of his fingers. He had leaned against it during moments of wonder. It had been his shelter during the rain, not because he needed shelter but because he loved the sound of rain meeting leaves. Would that tree remember his weight? Would it sigh when it no longer heard his breath? And what of the animals? The lion that nuzzled at his feet, the bird that sang each dawn before the voice walked near, the small creature with eyes too wide and fur too soft to name. Where would they go now? What happens to innocence when its witnesses are left behind? Eve remained in the dust, her back curved like a branch in mourning. She had not moved since the breath passed her. She did not need to. She was holding it not with arms but with the ache behind her eyes. That ache had no tears. It had no shape. It was a sacred tension, the knowing that something holy had left the world and left part of itself behind in her. Did the garden give her its last breath willingly? Or had it clung to her, hoping to live on inside her bones? She did not know, but she whispered softly, "I remember." Not for the garden's sake, but for her own sake, because memory is the only soil that sorrow can grow flowers in. Adam turned toward her then, his mouth opened, closed. He had no language for this kind of loss. So he sat beside her, in the dust, and for a long while they said nothing. The sky brightened not with joy but with the slow turning of time, and in that light Eden faded from sight, but not from the soul, for when something divine exhales its final breath it does not die. It becomes seed. They made no fire that night, not because they lacked the skill, but because the air was already heavy with something deeper than flame, the smoldering hush of something sacred undone. Eve lay on her side, eyes open, watching the faint silver curve of the moon. It seemed thinner now, farther, as though the sky itself had retreated, unsure how to look upon a world without a garden at its heart. What does the moon remember when it can no longer see the place where God walked? She reached toward the sky not with her hand, but with a feeling buried just behind her ribs. The garden had not been taken. It had receded, like a tide, like breath, like a promise too holy to remain where it had been broken. And yet it had not vanished entirely. There were fragments still caught in her, in the curl of her fingers, in the rhythm of her breath. in the tilt of her head when she listened to the wind and wondered if it carried words too soft for Adam to hear. There had been a moment just before they crossed the threshold when Eve thought the trees would follow her. Their branches had trembled, their leaves had leaned, the grass had whispered beneath her feet. But the garden had not moved, I only watched it, and now she could feel that gaze no more. Was that mercy, or was it the beginning of divine distance? Beside her, Adam slept, uneasily, his body curled as though trying to fold into something smaller, more hidden, as though he could undo what his hands had never meant to cause. She did not reach for him, not yet. They were still learning how to exist outside the light. Even love needs time to adjust to shadow. The stars were cold above them. Not cruel, just unaware. Eve closed her eyes and tried to remember the garden not as a place, but as a feeling. Warmth on her back as she ran, water cupped in her palms, the tree that hummed when she leaned against it, the fruit that glowed with laughter, the silence that was never empty, and the voice, oh, the voice. She had not heard it since the question, "Where are you?" She had not answered then. But now, as the garden's breath faded from the folds of the night, she whispered into the dust, "I am here." And the earth in its silence seemed to listen. Morning did not rise. It emerged slowly, reverently, like a priest entering a sanctuary now emptied of its holy vessel. The sky was not golden. It was pale, soft, as if unsure whether light should still return to a world no longer kissed by the garden's breath. Eve sat upright, arms folded across her knees, her hair still tangled with dust and wind. Her eyes found the line of trees far behind her, a horizon that no longer welcomed her gaze. And yet she looked. She could not see Eden, but she knew where it had been. And more than that, she knew what it had left behind. The ground near her feet bore a single flower, small, fragile, blue like the twilight before creation. It had not been there the night before. Eve reached out, fingertips trembling, and brushed its petals. They curled slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. Had the garden sent this? Had its breath taken root within her and seeded the earth without her knowing? Was this flower a memory blooming? Adam stirred. His eyes caught the color. He said nothing, but the soft furrow of his brow told her he remembered too. This blue, this exact blue, had once shimmered on a vine near the river's bend where they would rest after naming the creatures. That vine had only ever bloomed in the presence of laughter, and here it was blooming in exile. What if memory is not lost? What if Eden, though hidden, still breathes through us? Eve pressed her palm to the soil beside the flower. It was warmer than before, not with the sun. With something deeper, something holy. She closed her eyes and listened, not for the voice, but for the echo it once left behind. And faintly, faintly she felt it. The garden had exhaled, but it had not disappeared. Its final breath had scattered into her bones, into the soil, into the silence. And from that silence, new breath would rise. She opened her eyes again and whispered, "You are not gone." And in the distance, though no tree swayed, though no wind replied, the flower leaned toward her hand and did not fall. The sky had always been a friend. It had wrapped itself in soft blues and golds, painted dawns with laughter, and turned the edges of evening into velvet prayers. In Eden, it had not just been above them, it had breathed with them, watched over them like a gentle witness to every innocent touch, every holy breath. But now it was distant, not angry, not thunderous, just silent. What does it mean when the sky closes its mouth? What does it mean when heaven no longer replies? Eve stood alone, her hands cupped around her own breath as if trying to warm a silence that stretched farther than light. The morning was clear, too clear. The clouds had not come. Not to cry, not to shade, not to remind. It was as though the sky could not bear to look. She tilted her face upward. The sun had risen, but not for her. Its rays touched her skin without tenderness, its light too white, too distant. Where once the voice had spoken through the air, now there was nothing. No name called, no footsteps overhead, no whisper caught in the wind, and the birds, they had not returned. The ones outside Eden did not sing. They flew like shadows, dipping low over the barren fields, watching from high branches but never resting. never trusting. Did they remember? Or did they simply know she was not of this world? She raised her arms skyward, not in plea but in search. There was no answer, not even the hush of recognition. The silence above felt different than the silence of earth. The ground had accepted her, buried her leaves, and listened to her footsteps with reverence. But the sky had turned its face, lowered her hands and whispered aloud for the first time in days, "Do you still see me?" The wind did not rise, the light did not shift. Only her own voice returned, softened by dust and sorrow. Adam approached from behind, his feet crunching over the dry earth. He stopped when he reached her side, looked up with her. "Why won't he speak?" he asked quietly. Eve shook her head. "I think he is still speaking," she said, "but not in words we remember." What happens when the voice no longer echoes? Is it gone, or has it changed shape? The sky watched them, vast, pale, untouched. Not a single cloud moved across its face. And in that stillness, Eve felt the weight of exile, not as distance, but as silence. Not the silence of punishment, but the silence of being asked to walk by memory. Eve remembered the way the sky used to bend, not just with color, but with feeling. It would fold itself gently around the garden each evening, brushing the tops of trees with golden hush, swaddling every breath in light. At night, it became a ceiling of blessing, a dome that listened as she whispered names to the stars. Now that same sky stood high and flat, an unbroken sheet of cold blue, too quiet to bear. Was it always this far away, or had the garden drawn it close? She sat on a stone and looked upward until her eyes blurred. What do you do when the sky forgets how to answer? When the heavens hold their tongue, her chest ached not from sadness but from the absence of recognition. The sky, once intimate, now felt like a stranger, and strangers do not weep when you fall. Adam sat beside her, hands clasped, his shoulders hunched as though expecting rain that never came. "It feels wrong," he said softly. "The way it stares." Eve nodded. "It sees but does not speak." They were not used to seeing such things. The voice had once walked with them, not watched them. The stars had once hummed when she danced beneath them. The sun had once wrapped her like a shawl, warm and laughing. But this light was hollow. This air was mute. What if exile is not just the leaving, but being looked at by a world that does not know how to love you? She stood. The wind stirred slightly, then stilled. No birds called. No branch creaked. The sky remained untouched, wide and indifferent. She raised her arms again, not in prayer but in longing, a gesture that did not ask but remembered. And in the remembering something flickered, not in the sky, in her, a warmth, a pulse, a small light behind her ribs, like a forgotten name beginning to stir. Perhaps heaven was not refusing to speak. Perhaps it was waiting to be heard differently. Eve lowered her arms and placed her hands over her heart. If the voice no longer echoed through the sky, then maybe it had entered her. Maybe the silence above was meant to awaken the garden within. The day unfolded without sound. Even the dust beneath their feet seemed to quiet itself, as though fearful that too much movement might draw attention from above. Eve walked with care, her eyes occasionally flicking upward, not in hope but in habit. The sky had always responded before, with light, with wind, with warmth. Now I only watched it. What is a watcher that does not weep? She paused near a shallow stream, thin, hesitant, as though the water itself doubted its right to flow. She knelt, cupped her hands, and brought a few drops to her lips. The taste was strange, not bitter, just unaware. As if the stream had never known the garden, as if it had never reflected the face of one formed by divine breath. She stared at her reflection. The surface rippled with wind, but the eyes staring back were hers, and not hers. Eyes that had seen holiness retreat, eyes that had watched Eden close, eyes that now looked upward and received nothing. She touched her cheek. It was warm, alive, but no longer lit from within. Adam approached, his steps hesitant. "I dreamed," he said quietly. Eve stood, brushing her hands against her garment. "What did you see?" He hesitated. "I was back in the garden, but the sky was gone. It was only earth, trees above and below. No stars, no sun, only roots." Eve listened still, "And you?" she asked. "I couldn't find you," he said. She looked at him, not in pain but in understanding. Dreams now came with loss. Even in sleep, exile followed. She turned toward the sky again, pale blue, too wide, unmoved by prayer. "Maybe it still sees us," she said, "but not the way it used to." Adam followed her gaze. "Then how?" She breathed in slowly, like a parent watching their child walk into the world. "Without them." "No," she said, "with their memory and silence." The sky, unchanged, bore no answer, but the breeze stirred for a moment, just enough to lift a strand of her hair. And she felt it, not the voice, not the word, but the breath of being watched, not by judgment, by love too deep to speak. And sometimes love silences itself so we can remember how to listen. That evening the sky turned gold, not the gold of joy, the gold of parting. It painted the horizon like a wound, wide and quiet. A light that didn't rise but receded, not to sleep but to step away. Eve sat upon a smooth stone, knees to chest, watching that golden veil stretch thinner with every breath. It felt like watching a door close. But this door did not belong to Eden. It belonged to heaven. And heaven had nothing left to say. What do you do when even the sun turns its back gently so you don't notice it leaving? Adam gathered dry branches for a fire, though neither of them spoke of warmth. The act was enough. The movement, the illusion of control. They had once named things. Now they merely endured them. The flames crackled softly as night arrived, not rushed, not urgent, just certain. And with it came the sky, black, still, endless. Eve leaned back against the stone, her eyes tracing constellations she had yet to name. Shapes that meant nothing. Stars that blinked without rhythm, without story. In Eden, each star had seemed to sing. Now they only shimmered. Was it their song that had changed, or her ears? The fire beside her sighed. Adam stirred, placed another stick into the glow. She whispered, almost without breath, "Do you still look at me?" The sky did not blink, the stars did not fall, but in that vast hush above something shifted, not out there, within, a stillness that softened, a silence that didn't press but cradled. And she knew the voice had not vanished. It had stepped back to make room, not for punishment, for presence, her presence. She wrapped her arms around herself, not out of fear but reverence. Because when the sky no longer speaks, it might be listening, and when it listens, it waits. For you to remember what it once said before the world fell silent. He did not speak. He never had to. His wings were folded not in rest but in restraint. His sword, bright as morning before light was born, remained untouched in its sheath. The flames that encircled his form did not burn. They pulsed, slowly, like breath. Like sorrow, he stood at the edge of the garden, unmoved by wind or whisper, his gaze fixed not on the trees he guarded, but on the two shadows walking away. Eve did not turn to see him, but she felt him, not as a threat, as a witness. What kind of angel does not intervene? What kind of guardian stands still when sacred breath leaves sacred ground? He had been placed there not to punish, not to block, but to remember, to mark the moment when the holy left home, and heaven needed eyes to carry back the shape of their sorrow. The angel watched the curve of her spine, the dust on her feet, the weight of her silence. She was not glowing anymore, but she was radiant, radiant with ache, with memory, with the unbearable tenderness of a soul that had held God's breath, and now held its absence. The angel did not breathe, but something within his flame wavered, a flicker, a soft recoil, like light being asked to carry grief. Did he wonder why no legion had been sent? Did he ache with the knowledge that heaven had chosen not to stop them? Was there mercy in letting her go? Or was there a deeper law that love must watch even when it longs to reach? Eve paused once, hand resting on her belly, her head bowed beneath a sky that no longer spoke. The angel saw. And in that stillness, he bore witness to something heaven itself did not fully understand, what it means for holiness to walk away willingly. The angel had no name that she would recognize. Not yet. Names, after all, were given in Eden, shaped from joy, wrapped in laughter, breathed between the voice and the dust. But this one had been assigned without words. He had not been named to be known. He had been sent to stay, to stand at the seam between paradise and exile, to carry the silence of heaven where once its breath had walked. Eve, though far beyond the veil, now felt him behind her, a warmth that did not touch, a light that did not reach, but it was there, like a tear never shed. She did not know he watched her, not fully, but something in her bones still flinched when she stepped too far, not from fear, but from being seen by something she would never touch again. What does it mean to be remembered by an angel, and what does it mean to be forgotten by heaven? The angel did not blink. His eyes were not flesh. They were fire, not consuming but recording. And in that flame, the shape of her form, the cadence of her breath, the bend of her sorrow, all were sealed, not for judgment, for memory. For one day, heaven would ask, what did she look like when she walked away? And only this flame would answer. Behind him, Eden pulsed softly as though asleep beneath golden soil. The vines curled gently over the trees. The river no longer laughed. The fruit hung untouched, still warm with sunlight that would never again kiss human lips. The garden, too, had been sealed. But the angel remained outside the gates. Why? Why would heaven leave one of its own beyond the veil? Was he there to protect the way back? Or was he there to remind the earth that it had once been walked by a woman who carried the voice inside her? Eve paused again, not by intention. Her breath had caught in her throat. A memory had risen too quickly. The way the birds in Eden had called her name without sound. The way the stones beneath her feet had warmed as she passed. The way her own laughter had once startled the deer into stillness, as if joy were a language even the wild could understand. She did not cry, but her body remembered how. And the angel saw, not with pity, but with reverence, because sorrow worn with grace is the rarest garment of all. And when she walked on, step slow, spine steady, the flame within the angel's sword flared once, then dimmed. Not out of duty, out of awe. The night deepened. Stars unfurled their ancient arms across the sky, not to comfort, but to mark the passing of something the world would never fully name. Eve and Adam slept beneath branches that bore no fruit, in soil that did not yet know their names. The fire between them was faint, fed only by twigs and breath. And still he stood there, the angel unmoving, unblinking. His post was not a choice. It was a vow, etched not in time but in the will of the one who no longer walked among them. He was not bound by grief, but he was lit by it. The sorrow that hung on Eve's shoulders had draped itself over the world, and the angel, though untouched by exile, carried its echo in his flame. He watched her sleep. I watched the way her fingers curled toward her belly, watched the twitch in her brow as dreams whispered memories she could no longer visit. And as he stood, something began to shift within him. Not rebellion, not longing, but reverence. For what is more holy than sorrow carried without bitterness? What is more divine than a soul walking away from paradise and still choosing to remember the garden? He lowered his gaze once, not in shame, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. She had lost everything, and still she breathed. Heaven had not looked back, but he would look until his flame was extinguished, not to guard, not to punish, to honor, to mark the way her feet reshaped the dust, to remember the sound of exile's first breath. The sword at his side flicked, aired again, not out of warning, but out of bearing witness. Its fire was not wrath, it was a record. It burned with the memory of what love looks like when it leaves Eden. And beneath the veil of stars, as dawn crept toward the edges of the world, the angel remained, watching, until her shadow was no longer visible and yet still known. There is a silence only angels understand. It is not the absence of sound. It is the weight of what was never spoken. This angel bore that silence. He carried it not in his hands, for they had never held a sword in anger, but in his presence, in the unmoving flame that circled him. In this way he never stepped forward, though every pulse of his light longed to follow her. Eve, somewhere beyond the trees, stirred, not awake, not asleep. Her breath caught in her throat, not from dream, but from something older than memory. She felt eyes upon her, not of danger, of remembrance. A gaze that asked nothing, but I held everything. She whispered into the dark, "Why did you let me go?" The question was not meant for Adam, not meant for herself. It floated upward like smoke into the sky, into the hush where the voice once walked. The angel heard. He did not answer, but the flame at his shoulder bent slightly as if bowing to her grief. What if angels are not sent to explain but to stand? To stand where heaven cannot speak but refuses to forget? Eve sat up. The fire beside her had dimmed. She placed her hand over her chest where a slow ache had bloomed, not pain, not fear, but the echo of having once been known completely. She looked into the trees behind her. She saw nothing, but something inside her still remained. There was a presence, not near, but near enough. The kind of nearness that does not touch but never turns away. The kind of nearness that does not rescue but remembers. And in that moment, Eve understood. The angel was not there to guard a garden. He was there to guard the ache, to hold vigil over what was lost, to ensure that holiness did not vanish without witness. For what is sacred must be remembered, even when it is no longer seen, even when it can no longer return. She lowered her head, not in shame, in reverence. And in the unseen distance the angel's flame pulsed once more, not for God, not for law, for her. The first woman to leave Eden and carry its memory like a wound wrapped in light. The ground beyond Eden was not cursed, not yet. It simply had no name for her, no memory of the hands that shaped her. It was raw, untouched, unspoken over, unaware of what it meant to cradle a creature made of breath and wonder. Each step Eve took was a first, not for her, but for the earth itself. What does the soil feel when walked on by one who remembers being sculpted from it? Does it shudder beneath the weight of its own forgotten holiness? The dust clung to her ankles like a child unsure if it should follow. It did not yield easily. It did not part like Eden's soft moss. It gripped, it scattered, it resisted. It asked questions in the way it clung to her soles. Who are you, woman of breath? What do you carry that turns silence into sorrow? Adam said little. He walked ahead sometimes, then behind, as though unsure whether to lead or follow. His eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the land swelled and broke into hills unfamiliar. But Eve, she watched the ground. The way it cracked where she stepped, the way it held no scent, the way it refused to answer. She knelt once unbidden and placed her hand against it. It was warm, not alive, but waiting. It reminded her of the moment just before rain when the sky holds its breath and the trees lean forward. Only here there was no sky to sigh, no tree to lean on, just dust and silence. And something old, something buried deep beneath that had never before been awakened. What if this earth had never wept? What if her footsteps were the first sorrow it had ever known? She pressed her fingers deeper and the soil yielded slightly. Soft but not welcoming, curious. She whispered to it, not words, just breathe, just the sound of one who had once been part of it and was now a stranger. And the dirt listened. A wind passed behind her. It did not come from Eden. It rose from the ground itself, dry, thin, carrying no scent, no promise. Only the sound of something ancient stirring beneath the surface. Stood slowly, and for a moment the earth held her shape where she had knelt. A hollow, a memory, and something in the soil began to change. The wind scattered their footprints, not in cruelty, in confusion. The earth here had no known story. It had no known names. It had never been asked to remember. But now, beneath the weight of her steps, the dirt tried to hold on, clinging to the pattern of her heel, the impression of her knee, the soft print of fingers reaching down into what was once untouched. Eve did not weep, but the ground beneath her felt as though it might. Adam walked ahead. He paused at a ridge, eyes scanning the wide plain beyond, empty, cracked, stretching into the kind of silence that makes even breath feel like trespass. He turned and called softly, "There's nothing here." But Eve already knew that. Nothing has grown here yet. Nothing had died here yet. This land had never tasted blood. It had never swallowed bones. It had never borne the grief of burial. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes not on the sky, not on the distance, but on the ground itself. The layers of hardened clay. Dust gathered in corners of stone. The faint, strange warmth that pulsed beneath it all. There was something watching, not above, below, not a creature, not a shadow, but time itself, time waiting to begin, waiting to be marked by what the garden had never known, loss. The moment her foot pressed into a patch of earth darker than the rest, she stopped. The air changed, she felt it, something beneath her stilled, listened, and then returned to silence. What had stirred, what had heard her step? She looked at Adam. He had not noticed. She looked at the soil. It held no shape, no movement, but she knew. The dirt had memories now, and memory requires something to mourn. She knelt again and dug her fingers into the earth, not to plant, not to build, just to feel, to touch what had never touched her. The soil was dry, but soft beneath, like skin waiting for a scar. She pressed her palm down and closed her eyes, and in the stillness the earth answered, not with sound, with breath. A faint rise, a subtle shift. As if it had sighed beneath her hand. Was it fear or reverence? Or was this how the land prepared itself to receive death? The wind had gone still again, not above, beneath. It moved like a thought beneath the crust of earth, like breath trapped under layers of silence. Eve stood slowly, brushing dust from her palms, but it clung stubbornly, lining the creases of her skin like it wanted to stay, as though it knew something was coming, not yet, but soon. And once it came, the ground would never be the same. She walked forward, barefoot still. The soil is scratched now, it bit in places, it clung to others. The softness of Eden's moss had never spoken like this, never begged, never braced. This ground was preparing. But for what? Behind her, Adam said her name just once. It hung in the air like the first crack in glass. She turned. He was kneeling, his hand pressed to the earth the way she had done earlier. But his face, it was pale, uncertain. As though he'd felt it too. That breath, that tremor. That something just beneath them had opened its eyes for the first time. "What is it?" he asked. Eve didn't answer. She didn't have the language, not yet. But her body remembered something, not from Eden, but from the echo that came after. The ache in her hips, the pulse behind her navel, the stillness before pain. She placed her hand over her belly, and for a moment the soil beneath her seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. It was not just the earth that waited, it was time itself. Coiled, listening, longing. What happens when something holy touches something that has never been asked to carry sorrow? What happens when the soil is no longer just ground, but grave? She stepped back, not from fear, from reverence, because she knew. Somewhere within her, without words, without reason, she knew. This dirt would not remain untouched. It would drink tears. It would hold blood. It would open to receive what even the garden never knew. And in that knowing it had begun to tremble, as if preparing itself for the first death. Night returned quietly, wrapping the world in cool breath. But the air was different now, heavier, closer to the skin, as though the very dust had drawn nearer. Eve sat near the fire, eyes unfocused, listening not to the wind, not to Adam, but to the ground. It was speaking again, not with words, with waiting. The earth had never held a body. It had never been asked to close around something once filled with light. Eden had no graves. Its soil had only cradled roots and rivers, never ribs. Now, the land beneath their feet was listening for its first silence. What if the earth already mourned what had not yet died? Adam fed the fire in small handfuls, his fingers trembling slightly. He would not say what he felt, but Eve could see it, the tightening in his shoulders, the way he avoided her gaze, the way he kept glancing at the ground between them. He heard it too. The waiting, the weight, the whisper beneath. And Eve placed both palms on her belly and closed her eyes. She did not yet know the name of what grew within her, but she knew what it would bring. Life, yes, but also death, the first. She saw it not in vision, not in prophecy, but in the way the soil breathed. It rose like a wave beneath her spine, pulsing softly, aching as though already pierced. She whispered into the dust, "You have never buried breath." The earth did not answer. It only waited. Would it tremble when it first closed around warm flesh? Would it sing when it received the blood of innocence? Or would it weep, cracking open with sorrow too old for language? The fire popped. Adam looked up. Their eyes met. And in that moment neither spoke, because they both knew this ground, this dry, forgotten soil would soon carry something Eden never did. A name, etched not in wind, but in death. By dawn the ground had stilled, not in peace, in preparation. Eve woke with her hand still resting on the earth, her fingers curled slightly as though holding something invisible. The dust clung to her skin, pressed into her palms like ash that had once been holy. She sat slowly. Adam had not slept. His eyes were hollow, fixed on the horizon. He had not moved from the place where the soil breathed. Neither of them had spoken the word, but it hovered, death. It had not come, but its shadow had arrived. And the land, once silent, was learning to listen for endings. Eve stood and stepped barefoot into the morning, the sun low, pale, unsure of its role in this new world. She moved slowly, reverently, the way one walks through a sanctuary after the candles have been extinguished. Her feet pressed into the dust, and this time the earth did not recoil. It accepted her, not with joy, but with readiness, because now it knew what she carried, a seed, a sorrow, a story that would one day return to its soil. She knelt and dug her fingers gently into the ground, not to bury, not to plant, but to greet, to acknowledge the silent covenant between womb and earth. She whispered softly, not to be heard, but to be witnessed, "You will hold what I cannot keep." She did not weep. She pressed her forehead to the dirt, letting her breath mingle with the stillness. The earth pulsed once beneath her cheeks, soft, slow, like an echo, and she understood the ground was not cursed, it was being prepared. And somewhere in its deep, dry belly, it was learning a word it had never needed before: grave. The sound reached her before the sight, a whisper, not wind, not voice. Water, but not like Eden's laughter-fed streams, not like the rivers that danced through the garden, weaving joy through roots and stones. This one sounded heavy, slow, as though each drop carried a memory it had not chosen to keep. Eve walked toward it, barefoot, cautious. The dust gave way to stones and the ground cooled. The air grew damp, the scent of stillness clinging to the edges of her breath. Then she saw it, a river, thin, wandering, uncertain. It did not carve, it remembered. The current moved strangely, curling in slow spirals, turning back toward its own mouth as if unsure whether to continue. What river runs toward its beginning? What water flows not forward but home? Eve stepped closer. The surface shimmered, not with light but with history. Her reflection appeared faint, then stretched, then broke into ripples without wind. And she felt it, not the garden but its echo. This river had once touched Eden's edge. Long ago, before gates, before exile, it had brushed against holy roots, cooled the feet of lions, mirrored the light of trees that never withered. It had carried the breath of the voice in its mist. But now it flowed through dust, through wilderness, through memory. And memory does not move cleanly, it twists, it returns, it forgets. Eve knelt beside the bank. The water swirled toward her fingers, paused, then turned away, not in rejection, in grief. It recognized her. And she remembered it, a river near the eastern garden wall, one that had once run clear and free, playful and bold. She had bathed there in morning light, named birds as they dipped their wings along its surface. But now the birds are gone, and the river no longer laughed. It ran backward, not toward Eden, but toward what it used to be. Toward a time when it had not yet carried sorrow. She dipped her hand in. The cold pierced her wrist, and in that shock a memory surfaced, sharp, sudden. The first time the voice had walked beside her near the water, not speaking, just walking, breathing, being, and she had felt safe, whole, known. Now the river pulled away from her touch, as if even it could not bear what had been lost. The water curved around her hand like a forgotten sentence, not spoken, not broken, just paused mid-breath. Eve did not pull away. She let the cold rise through her skin, into her arm, into her chest. It moved like morning, slow, deliberate, gentle where it could have been cruel. Beside her the reeds bent without wind. The stones, smooth and rounded, seemed older than speech. This river had not forgotten her, but it no longer knew how to hold her. What if memory becomes pain when it cannot return? She whispered to it, not in words, in silence. A silence shaped by remembering. The current shifted. Turned again. It spiraled in place like a loop caught in longing. Not forward, not back, just circling. And she knew it was trying to ret. Earn to the garden, trying to find the path that had been sealed, trying to reverse the story it could not rewrite. What river dreams of its own beginning? She cupped some of the water in her palm and held it to her lips. It did not taste like Eden, it tasted like dust, of waiting, of something once holy now wandering without a home. And yet as it touched her tongue, her body remembered joy. Just for a moment, just a breath. The way she used to run barefoot on moss-soaked banks, laughter trailing behind her like a veil of sunlight. The way Adam used to call her name not in need but in delight. The way the voice had once let silence fall between them, not as absence but as trust. She stood slowly. The water fell from her fingers like light sliding off stone, and still it circled, still it turned. She stepped into the shallows. The current parted around her ankles, not in welcome but in reverence. The river would not stop her, but it would not carry her either, because it was not flowing toward the future. It was flowing toward memory, and memory is not a place we're meant to live. It's a place we're meant to bless. Eve closed her eyes. She said the garden's name, but only in her heart, and the river still, just for a moment, as if it had heard its mother's voice and wept without sound. Adam remained on the bank. He did not call her back. He simply watched, his shadow reaching for her across the water, long and trembling. He had never seen her like this, not since Eden, not since the voice had last walked with them. She stood waist-deep now, the river turning slowly around her as if it could not decide which way time should move. Her hands rested on the surface, fingers open, not breaking the water, only holding it. The current touched her, then recoiled. It was as though the river feared what she carried, not her weight, her memory. For what is heavier than remembrance in a land that no longer believes? What is harder to bear than the shape of joy in a world preparing for sorrow? Eve opened her eyes. She looked to the far side of the river, not because something called her, but because something was absent. There was no song there, no voice, no fruit, just bare trees, dry hills, and silence that did not know how to listen. And yet the river still tried to return. Its movement was a question, its turning a prayer. It asked, "Where did the light go? Why do you walk away? Will you come back if we run backward long enough?" Eve stepped forward once more. The water rose, and as it touched her belly, the river paused, not from resistance, from awe. It recognized what she carried, and it knew it would one day hold it, not now, but soon. A child, a life, a loss. The first seed of mortality growing within the breath of the first woman. The river circled her slowly, one final turn. Then it continued backward. Not because it would ever reach Eden, but because I had to try, because memory must move, even if the path no longer exists. Eve stepped back to the bank. The water released her. It did not cling. It did not pull. It simply folded behind her like a veil, one last ripple, one last remembrance. And as her feet touched the soil once more, the river whispered and ran backward into silence. She didn't dry her feet. The water clung like a blessing or a wound she was not ready to wipe away. Each drop held something sacred. Each step left a trail of memory on the dust, fading with the morning light. Adam looked at her when she returned to the shore, but he did not speak. There are moments even love does not interrupt. The fire between them had gone cold. Neither of them reached to relight it. Not yet. Eve sat, knees to chest, her wet hair hanging like a curtain of silence across her face. The wind moved softly now, not from the trees, not from the sky, but from the river's breath still trailing behind her. She closed her eyes and saw it again, the spiral. The river folded inward as if trying to remember the first time it had reflected the stars, the first time it had carried laughter, the first time it had cooled the feet of the voice. And she asked not aloud, but with the ache behind her ribs, "Why did you let the river forget how to sing?" But no answer came. Only the sound of water returning to where it began. Behind her, Adam stirred the ashes of the fire with a broken branch. He looked toward the path they would walk next, dry, long, unnamed. "This place," he said, voice rough with dust, "it's not like the garden." Eve nodded, her gaze still fixed on the trail of wet footprints fading in the dirt. "No," she said, "it remembers differently." He sat beside her. Neither of them reached for the other, but the silence between them no longer hurts. Because the river had whispered something only the soul could carry. You cannot return to Eden. but Eden remembers you. And as the last of her footprints disappeared in the heat of the morning sun, Eve pressed her hand into the dirt, and it stayed. Damp a little longer. It still hung in her memory, untouched, unbit, whole, not the fruit that opened her eyes, not the one that changed the rhythm of her breath and veiled the world in knowing, but the other one. The one she passed every morning, fingers brushing against its branches with reverence but never needed. The fruit she did not eat. It had glowed a pale gold in the garden's hush, hidden deeper within the grove where the air was cooler, where the soil smelled like morning before light. It had no serpent, it had no warning, only silence, holy, weightless silence. What happens to a choice never made? Does it echo? Does it still watch us? Eve remembered standing beneath that tree, not once, many times. It had called to her, not in voice but in stillness, as if it knew her name without ever speaking it. She had reached for its fruit once, just once. Her fingers had stopped an inch away, trembling not from temptation but recognition. This fruit had nothing to prove. No promise to offer, no mystery to unwrap. It was just there. And perhaps that was why she feared it, because some fruit carries not knowledge but peace, and peace once held is the hardest thing to release. Now as she knelt on foreign soil far from the tree's roots, she saw it again, not in vision but in the hollowness that followed her choices. The fruit she did not eat, the silence she did not break, the question she never dared ask: what would I have become if I had chosen stillness instead? Adam built a circle of stones nearby, his hands dark with dust, stacking a shelter with the slowness of someone who no longer expected things to last. He did not know what she remembered. He never saw that tree. It had only ever spoken to her. And now it is gone, sealed behind flame, unreached, unrotted, untouched. Eve traced a small circle in the dirt with her finger, round, full, whole. Not all knowing is born from tasting. Some knowledge comes from walking away. But even now, she sometimes wondered what the fruit would have said if she had listened long enough to hear it ripen. She hadn't told Adam, not because she wished to hide, but because there are some silences a woman must carry alone, not out of secrecy, but out of holiness. That tree had not been forbidden. No voice had warned her against it. No angel had drawn flame near its roots. And still, she had left it untouched. What if restraint is not always obedience? What if it is the memory of what you could have taken, but chose to revere? Eve sat near the fire, its glow faint in the dust-blown dusk. She traced the image of the fruit again in the dirt, a soft oval, a stem, a gentle curve. It did not look like power, it looked like peace. And peace, she now knew, was the most fragile thing of all. Adam spoke to her quietly as he worked. "We should move soon, this place is too open." She nodded, but her gaze remained downward. "Do you remember," she asked, "the tree behind the pool near the eastern wind?" He paused. "I remember the wind, the way it warmed the leaves at dusk." She nodded. "There was a tree there with golden fruit. We passed it 100 times." He searched her face. "I never saw it." Of course he hadn't. Some trees only speak to those who carry silence like breath. Eve touched her belly where life stirred faintly beneath the hush of night. Would this child carry that same silence? Would he pass by beauty and choose stillness? Or would he chase the noise as they had? She didn't know. But she feared that stillness would become stranger to the world with each generation. She looked at the sky. The stars had returned, but she no longer felt their gaze. They were not watchers now, they were witnesses. Silent, distant, content to observe without interruption, like the fruit. Silent, present, never taken. Perhaps that was its gift. It did not offer anything, and so it could never be stolen. What would it have tasted like? What would it have changed? Or was its purpose simply to remain unchosen, a mirror to the desire that could resist desire? She closed her eyes, and in that stillness she saw the tree once more. Its leaves shimmered without light. Its fruit hung low, heavy and patient. It had waited for her, and she had walked away. The tree had no thorns, no threat, no twisting roots or coiled shadows. Its trunk rose smooth and quiet, bark pale like pressed linen, branches outstretched as if in prayer, not for mercy but for memory. Eve remembered its shape better than any word she had ever spoken. It had stood near the place where the river bent toward the light, a corner of Eden untouched even by the songs of birds. No one spoke there. Even the voice had passed it without words, because silence lives in sacred things, and that tree was silent and made whole. Now, as she watched the fire flicker against the bones of gathered branches, she remembered the weight of the moment when she almost reached for it. It was dusk, not long before. Everything changed. Air was thick with gold. Adam had laughed something about the lion's cubs playing too close to the fig grove. She had wandered off, not in rebellion, in rest. And there it was, the fruit, not red, not gleaming, not tempting, just full, still, and heavy with patience. She had lifted her hand toward it just once, and in that breath she heard nothing. No serpent, no warning, no wind. Just the hush of something watching her choose reverence over hunger. It had been the purest silence of her life. And she had stepped back, not because she was afraid to take it, but because something in her already understood. Some fruit exists only to be seen, not held, not tasted, not altered by teeth or time, but I remembered. And now in exile, when all was noise and ache and motion, it was that fruit, not the one she tasted, but the one she didn't, that returned to her. Why? Because restraint leaves a deeper mark than indulgence. Because memory clings harder to what was untouched. Or because even in the leaving she had carried some piece of wisdom unspoken. Adam stoked the fire. The flames rose. Eve did not look away from the dark. She whispered so softly the dust barely heard, "I didn't take it." Not in pride, in grief. Because no one would ever know the holiness of that moment but her. And no one would sing songs about the fruit she chose to leave behind. Sleep did not come easily that night. Not because the wind was cruel or the ground too hard, but because memory kept whispering beneath her eyelids. It wasn't the garden as a whole she saw, not the rivers or vines or sacred sky, but the golden fruit. It hovered, suspended, untouched, a silence in the shape of a question. She dreamed of it now, not as a temptation, but as a witness. A quiet eye that had watched her grow, watched her laugh, watched her choose. In the dream, she stood before it again, alone. The branches bowed slightly toward her, the leaves curling inward like breath held just beneath the ribs. The fruit was within reach, again. And yet again she did not take it, she only listened. And in that listening, something sacred opened within her, not knowledge, not sorrow, but a stillness deeper than understanding. And when she woke, the fire was low. Ash drifted upward like forgotten prayers. Adam was asleep, curled near the stones. And the stars, they were closer, not in the distance, in memory. She sat up slowly, the chill of dawn brushing against her skin. Her hand found the dust again, and without thinking she drew the shape once more, the fruit, the one she had not eaten. And this time she drew a second circle beside it, smaller, incomplete, as if something had been taken from it before it had ripened. A child, maybe. A silence passed on, a stillness that would not survive the generations. She looked toward the dark horizon where the morning had not yet risen. Would they ever understand? Would her children, her children's children, know that not every story was shaped by sin? Some were shaped by what we spared, by what we refused to consume, by the sacred quiet of walking away. And what if, just what if, it was that choice, the one no one saw, that made her worthy to carry the ache of the world? Not the fruit that opened her eyes, but the one she left hanging in the light. The sky was clear, too clear. It stretched overhead without breath, without pulse, a ceiling painted with silence. The stars blinked not in rhythm but like eyes too distant to care. The wind moved through the grasses but it did not sing. And the fire, though alive, gave no warmth. It was the first night. The first night without the voice, not absence, not abandonment, just stillness. That terrible, sacred stillness. Eve wrapped her arms around her knees and stared at the black beyond the flame. There had always been a sound before, a presence in the dark, a whisper in the leaves. Even in silence she had felt him, the voice that filled the garden without words. But now there was nothing, not above, not around, not within. What happens to a soul when the voice that named it no longer speaks? What happens to breath when it no longer echoes back? She had called out earlier, not loudly, not with weeping, just a single breath. The name she had once spoken without lips, without tongue, the name that had once answered through birdsong and rivers and the hush of golden light. But the name did not return. It dissolved into the dust like it had never been spoken, like she had never been known. She laid her head on her knees, and the silence wrapped around her like a second skin. It did not hurt, not in the way thorns do. It ached, the ache of being remembered by no one. Adam shifted nearby. His sleep was uneasy. His hands twitched, searching for dreams that had vanished with the garden. He had not called out, not once. Eve wondered if he, too, felt it, this vacancy, this veil between them and the one who once walked beside them at dusk, but he would not speak of it, not yet, not tonight, and so she bore it alone. The first night when the voice no longer walked in the cool of evening. The first night when the silence was not sacred but empty. She looked to the stars. They did not answer. She looked to the sky. It did not open. She looked at her own hands, and even they felt far from the breath that once filled them. Was she still holy? Was she still his? Or had the garden taken that with it, leaving her only memory? She did not know. But still she whispered, "I am still here." Not because she believed he heard her, but because the night needed someone to say something. The fire cracked once, then stilled. Even flame seemed unsure how to speak in a world where the voice no longer lingered. Eve watched the glow flicker against Adam's face, soft, pale, aging without time. His brow furrowed in sleep, his lips parted slightly as if waiting for something to return. She knew that posture. She had worn it all day. It was the shape of absence, the weight of waiting. And yet the voice did not come. Not in the wind, not in the water, not in the womb, only silence, thick, endless, cold. How does one learn to live when heaven no longer walks with them? She remembered the way the voice used to approach, not from above but from within. It filled the garden with scent like light, not loud but near, intimately near, as if it breathed with her breath, moved with her thoughts. Now her thoughts echoed in a hollow cave. Every prayer returned unanswered. Every sigh collapsed before rising. She pressed her hand to the earth, hoping foolishly that maybe the soil remembered the voice's weight, the rhythm of divine footsteps. But the dirt was silent. It did not pulse beneath her fingers. It did not tremble in reply. And she realized even the ground had forgotten. What happens to creation when its maker goes quiet? Does the world become orphaned? Does it forget the pitch of its own birth? She stood slowly, wrapping the thin cloth around her shoulders. The air pressed in, not cold, just indifferent. She stepped away from the fire and into the open plain, barefoot, barehearted, watching her shadow stretch under moonlight. She walked, and with each step the silence grew louder. It hummed beneath her ribs. It curled behind her ears. It replaced what had once been a presence. And still she walked, because walking was all she had left. She reached a small rise of stone and sat, curling her knees to her chest. She looked upward, not in hope, in habit. And the sky, vast and unblinking, offered her no sign. Only stars, still, silent, witnesses who refused to speak. She whispered again, not with voice but with breath, "Am I still yours?" The wind did not move, the earth did not shift, but something within her pulsed, a memory, a sound. A shadow of the voice long buried in her marrow. It did not answer, but it remained. And sometimes remaining is enough. She did not sleep. Sleep belonged to those who dreamed without dread, who lay under skies that still carried the weight of a blessing. But this sky had emptied itself of voice and filled itself with distance. Eve lay with eyes wide open, watching the darkness press against the stars. They were too far away, too still. Like eyes that remembered but refused to speak. She missed the sound of walking in the garden, not her feet but his, the hush of light moving through trees, the breath between questions, the nearness of being known. And now the world was wide and the silence between her and heaven stretched like a wound. Was this the new way, to live without being heard, to build without being guided, to ache with no reply? She rose from her bed of leaves and stepped barefoot across the sleeping earth. Each footfall stirred dust but not memory. Even the soil seemed hesitant now, unsure whether to cradle or forget. Adam slept nearby, mouth open slightly, brows furrowed, dreaming perhaps of things that once were, or perhaps dreaming of nothing. Eve did not envy him. She longed not for escape, but for the return of sound, not noise, not wind, but the voice that once called her name like it was a river returning home. She looked upward. The sky remained, unbroken, untouched, unmoved. And in its silence she said the name, the one she had not spoken since Eden, the one that felt too sacred to pass through her lips. She whispered it once, trembling, aching, offering it like a flower into fire. There was no echo. But the breath that carried it did not fall. It rose, and that was enough. For the first time that night, the silence did not feel empty, it felt holy. By morning she had not closed her eyes, but something in her heart had softened, not with comfort, but with understanding. The voice was not gone, it had become hidden, folded deeper within the fabric of the world, woven into things that did not speak. The silence she now saw was not absent, it was an invitation. No. T shutting out, but a calling in. A whisper only heard when all else is quiet. Eve knelt beside a patch of earth where no grass had grown. The dust was cool beneath her knees. She placed her hands in it, not to sow, not to seek, just to feel. And as she breathed slow and steady, she remembered the garden had been a temple of sound, but this exile would become a temple of silence. And she must learn to worship in both. Behind her, Adam stirred. His first words that morning were hushed, as if the silence had shaped his voice too. "You didn't sleep." She shook her head. "I listened." He nodded, as if he understood. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he too had whispered into the dark and waited for a reply that never came, but somehow felt heard anyway. Eve stood. The dust fell from her hands like ash, but beneath it warmth lingered. She looked toward the horizon. It was still empty, still dry, still unknown, but she was no longer waiting for the sky to speak. She was ready to walk with the voice buried in her chest, small, faint, but alive. That night had not broken her. It had carved her, made her hollow enough to hold a different kind of presence. And when the wind finally rose, gently stirring the branches of a tree that had not yet learned to bear fruit, she did not ask it to carry an answer. She let it pass. And she whispered, "I will not stop remembering." The garden did not die, it sank, slowly, quietly, as though it knew it could no longer be seen with eyes, as though it chose to become something deeper than memory, something buried, something holy, something hidden beneath the waking world. Eve felt it beneath her steps sometimes, not often, only in stillness, when the wind held its breath, when the sky watched without blinking, when the dust refused to move. Then beneath her heel, beneath her ribs, beneath the ache in her breath, she felt the bones of the garden, not a skeleton, not ruin, but structure, the shape of something that once held the breath of God, and now there is only silence. Was it still there, buried under stone and root, or had it dissolved into memory, not erased, but absorbed into her marrow? She could not say, but she knew the feeling. That hush that came when she walked too near a tree with branches bent like prayer. That hum beneath the soil when the wind passed through certain patches of wilderness. There were places where the world still bowed, where the air felt soft again, where the silence did not sting, it soothed. That was where the garden had gone, not away, but under. What happens to holiness when it is hidden? Does it die, or does it become more sacred? Eve believed the latter because she still carried it, in her blood, in her bones, in the ache between memory and breath. She could no longer name the paths, could no longer point to where the fig tree stood or where the lion first laid its head beside her feet. But she could close her eyes and feel it. The garden had not left. It had buried itself beneath exile and waited. There was a place they passed once, days beyond the river, where the trees grew in a perfect circle. No birds sang there. No wind stirred the leaves. The ground was warm, not from the sun, but from memory. Eve felt it the moment her foot crossed the outer ring. A heaviness, a hush. The kind of silence that feels like breath being held for something sacred. She stopped. Adam did too, though he hadn't seen anything unusual. But she knelt, pressed her palm to the soil. It thrummed faintly, soft, like music played through stone. It was not Eden, but I remembered. Some root, some seed, some sliver of divine breath still pulsed there, the garden's echo buried in the marrow of the world. She whispered, almost afraid, "Did you leave pieces behind?" There was no answer. But beneath her hand, the dirt felt like the pages of a closed book, warm with story, quiet with age. What if Eden did not vanish? What if it broke gently, scattered itself across the earth so that the world would never be entirely without holiness? She sat in the middle of the circle, cross-legged, eyes closed. And for a moment she could almost feel the garden blooming again. A breeze that smelled of figs, a laugh that sounded like running water. The hush of wings overhead, not in flight but in blessing. Tears came slow and saltless, not for what was lost, but for what was buried and still alive. Adam stood at the edge, watching. He would never hear what she heard, but he honored it. And when she finally stood, the imprint of her body remained in the dust, a soft shape as if the earth had cradled her in return. She did not speak as they walked on, but the garden had spoken to her, without words. And in the hush between heartbeats she heard what it said. "We are not gone, we are underneath, and we are waiting to rise." That night Eve dreamt of roots, not twisting or writhing but reaching. They spread like fingers beneath the surface of the world, soft and moving not with hunger but with memory. Each root glowed faintly like breath caught in sleep, threading beneath mountains, rivers, and silence. She followed them in her dream, barefoot, weightless. The soil parted for her, but not because she commanded it, because it remembered her, because the garden still knew her name. The deeper she went, the quieter the dream became. No birds, no wind, no sky, only heartbeat, only root. Only light curling gently in the dark, the garden's skeleton, its breath, its buried promise. And at the center, a tree, not alive, but not dead. Its trunk split and hollow, its limbs wrapped around something unseen. It did not glow. It did not move, but it pulsed once every long while like it was remembering how to be whole. She stepped toward it, reached out, not to touch, just to witness. And as she stood there, eyes wide, the roots beneath her feet hummed a single truth: "We have not left you." When she woke, the world was gray. Dawn had not broken, but the darkness had softened. She sat up slowly, her body still holding the dream like a bowl holding warmth long after the water was gone. She placed her hand on the ground beside her and whispered, "I remember." The dust stirred faintly as if in reply, not in the wind, not in voice, but in nearness. Adam remained asleep, and Eve rose, stepped quietly away from the camp, and knelt once more in the open plain. No trees, no rivers, no sign of the garden, but she knew. Beneath her the roots still pulsed, still reached, still held the shape of something sacred. She pressed her forehead to the earth, not in grief, in reverence, because even in exile the bones of the garden were still breathing. The next day, as they walked along a ridge of crumbled stone, Eve paused at a crack in the earth. It was narrow, no wider than her hand, but it breathed. A soft wind rose from it, warm and damp, carrying no scent, no sound, just presence. It moved over her skin like a forgotten name. She knelt beside it, traced the edge with her fingers, and felt again that familiar ache. Not loss, recognition. It was Eden, buried deeper now, hiding not in distance but in depth. She did not try to open it. Some doors are not meant to be forced. Some roots are not meant to rise. But she leaned close and listened, not for words, for a pulse, the hum beneath the stone. The garden's breath, slowed by sorrow, but still moving, still alive. Adam called gently from ahead. She did not answer, not yet. Her hand remained on the crack. She whispered, "I remember how you walked." The silence held. Then the earth warmed beneath her palm, just slightly, just long enough to let her know it remembered too. She rose without a word, not because the moment had ended, but because the garden had spoken all it needed to say. And some holiness is meant to be carried in silence. As they continued their journey, the wind followed behind them, not chasing, not rushing, simply walking at a distance. And far below their feet, beneath rock and time and the weight of forgetting, the bones of the garden stirred. That evening the stars returned without ceremony. They scattered across the sky like forgotten seeds, too distant to name, too silent to guide. Eve lay on her side, watching them blink, her breath soft, her body still wrapped in the hush of the earth's whisper. She could still feel it, the warmth beneath the stone, the thrum in the dust, the unseen tree wrapped around itself like prayer. The garden had never left her. It had simply buried itself deeper than grief. And maybe that was mercy. Maybe some sanctuaries survive by becoming unfindable. She turned toward Adam. He was asleep again, arms crossed over his chest, as if guarding a memory he no longer spoke aloud. They had built no altar, no monument, only a fire, but even that she now understood was enough, because the fire cracked like branches once did in the garden, because the smoke rose like incense from fruit they never finished naming, because even in the wilderness memory could burn. She closed her eyes, not to forget, but to see. And in that darkness the garden came not as vision but as ache. An ache that pulsed in her breath, in her bones, in the space beneath her ribs where joy once sat like sunlight. The ache did not ask to be healed, only honored, so she whispered into the night, not to awaken the past but to promise it rest. "You are not lost, you are planted." And with those words she finally slept. And beneath the ground, where no man had yet dug, where no seed had yet died, the bones of the garden shifted once more, not to rise, but to wait. She had not looked back when they left the garden, not fully, not with her eyes, but something behind her ribs had remained turned toward the gate, the place where the fire had been set. Not to chase, not to destroy, only to mark the line between what was holy and what was human. Eve remembered the flame. It did not rage, it did not scream. It stood tall, unmoving, like an angel with no name. It had not spoken to her, but it had seen her. And in that moment, that final breath before exile, she had stepped past it, and it had not touched her. Why? She had wondered that for many nights. Why did the flame not devour her? Why did it not stop her? She had broken the silence. She had tasted the fruit. She had covered her skin with leaves not made by the wind. She had walked toward the dust. Why did the fire let her go? Now, with the stars watching again and her belly heavy with the ache of beginning, she remembered its heat. Not the kind that burns, the kind that watches, sacred, still. A fire not of wrath, but of witness. What if it hadn't been there to punish? What if it had only been placed to grieve? Adam had never spoken of it. He had turned his face away when they passed. But she had looked, just once, and the fire had looked back. And in its flicker she had seen something terrible and beautiful, a mercy that did not follow, a holiness that allowed her to leave. And now she wondered if that fire still stood, if it still burned, if it still waited, not to guard the garden, but to remember the woman who walked past it and did not forget what lived behind her. The wind carried ash that night, not from the skies, but from memory. Fine and gray, like dust from wings long folded, it settled in the folds of Eve's garments, clinging to her wrists, her throat, the place where voice becomes breath. She did not wipe it away. She knew this ash. It was the same that drifted through her dreams the night before the exile, the same that once rested in the crook of the serpent's coil, silent and watching. And though no fire burned nearby, the scent of smoke lingered, not harsh, not bitter, but ancient, like an altar that had not been used in years, yet still whispered of incense. Was it possible for fire to follow you, not in flame, but in memory? Could heat live inside the body long after the light had vanished? Eve sat near the cold embers of their camp, fingers tracing spirals in the soil. She wasn't cold, she wasn't warm, she was waiting, and the silence around her began to hum, not with sound, but with knowing. That same knowing she felt when the fruit touched her tongue. That same knowing that hadn't left her since the garden closed behind them. She turned slowly and saw nothing. Only at night, only wind. Only Adam slept beside the stones, but within that nothing she felt presence, something old. Something watchful, not cruel, not kind. Just there, she whispered, "Why didn't you burn me?" The wind did not answer, but a single coal in the dead fire at her feet cracked. A spark, faint, brief, then gone, but she had seen it. The flame still knew her name, and perhaps that was the answer. She was not untouched by fire because she was innocent. She was untouched because the fire had already recognized her and chose not to unmake what was already becoming something else. She remembered the warmth in her palms when she first held the fruit, not the heat of shame that came later, but the heat of awareness, the moment something awakened in her veins as if she had swallowed light, not sunlight, but something older, something lit before the sky was even named. And she wondered now if the fire at the gate had recognized that same light within her. Had it seen itself reflected in her blood? Is that why it had not burned her? Because it could not. Because some flames are kin to one another, even when they flicker in different worlds. She rose slowly from the dust, her eyes still cast toward the dark horizon. Her feet pressed into the soil, remembering Eden not as a place, but as a pulse. There was no fire before her now, but she felt the same stillness, the same gaze, the same hush that had lived in the flame's body like a breath never exhaled. Adam stirred in his sleep, murmuring a name she no longer recognized. He did not speak of the gate. He never had. Perhaps he had seen something different in the fire. A warning, a sword, a wound, but she had seen something else. She had seen grief, not rage, grief that stood still. Grief that had learned not to stop those who chose exile, and that grief had taken the form of flame. What did it mean to be grieved by God? What did it mean to be released by mercy so fierce it looked like fire? She had asked that question for years in silence. And now, with the ashes on her skin and the sky holding its breath, she whispered it once more. What if the fire was never meant to protect the garden, but to remember me? And far away, so far even her spirit could barely touch the memory, a flicker danced against the darkness. Not a fire, not a vision, but a wound still warm. The night grew deeper, but time did not pass. It folded. It curled around Eve like the smoke of a fire long dead, pressing into her skin with questions she did not know how to answer. Was the flame still burning? Has it ever stopped? Or had it simply moved, not through the world, but through her? The child within her stirred, not in pain, not in fear, but with the rhythm of something old remembering how to be born. And suddenly Eve knew the gate had not closed to keep her out. It had closed so that the garden could remain a dream, not a cage. Because what if she had been allowed to return? What if the door was always open? Would she have gone back? Would she have searched for the trees, the rivers, the voice that once called her by name? Or had she already begun planting Eden in the wilderness? One seed, one breath, one memory at a time. She touched her belly, not to soothe, to listen. And in that silence she heard not a heartbeat, but a whisper of flame, not fire, not destruction, but the same soft glow that had once stood at the edge of all things, neither forbidding nor welcoming, simply bearing witness. The same glow that had passed from hand to fruit, from breath to exile, from garden to womb. She knelt and placed both hands on the ground. It was cold, but not lifeless. It trembled not with movement, but with memory. She closed her eyes, and behind her eyelids the fire rose once more. It did not speak, but it waited, not at the garden's gate, but in the hollow space between her ribs and her soul. And in that space it asked the one question that had no answer. Do you remember who you were before the silence? She did not respond, but her tears did. And in their warmth the fire wept too. The dawn had not yet come, but something shifted in the dark. Not a sound, not a wind, but a loosening, as if the night itself exhaled. Eve sat still, her hands in the earth, her thoughts inside the flame. She was not waiting for the light. She was remembering the heat. And with each breath she began to feel it, not outside her, but within. A warmth that did not burn. A holiness that did not punish. A presence that did not speak in words, but in weight. The kind that settles in bones, in blood, in silence. Was that what the fire had always been? Not judgment, but remembrance. Not wrath, but a witness. The fire had stood at the edge of Eden like an angel who had forgotten how to lift its sword. It had been placed there to guard, but perhaps even it had mourned. Mourned the woman who walked away, not in defiance, but in knowing that something had begun. That exile was not an ending, but the only door large enough for birth. She rose now slowly, her palms dusted with soil and ash, her body heavier than the night. The child stirred again. Not in fear, in rhythm, as if listening for something older than lullabies. Eve turned her face upward. The stars were fading not into morning but into the veil that comes before it, and she whispered one final question to the silence. Did the fire remember me the way I remembered it? There was no answer, only a flicker in her chest, a heat that did not move, a glow that did not fade. And in that stillness she knew the fire had never left. It had only stepped aside. To let her become the garden, to let her carry the memory in her breath, to let her light something new without burning anything behind her. And in the hush between heartbeats where God no longer speaks aloud, a question remained. What if the last thing the flame ever said was go, before the flood, before the cities, before even the first grave returned dust to dust? There was a river no one could find, because it did not run through soil. It ran through her, not through her veins but beneath them. Not through her heart but under its shadow. It was the river that remembered her shape before she was flesh, before she was breathing, before she was Eve. And though no map would name it and no prophet would draw it, the river knew her. It curved beneath her ribs like a prayer forgotten mid-sentence. It hummed beneath her skin like the garden trying to call her back. And on the final night, when all was still and the child within her no longer stirred, she heard it, not with her ears, but with the ache that lives in the bones of women who have carried worlds they were never allowed to name. What was this river? Was it the remnant of Eden's own waters? Had it followed her, hidden and quiet, from the moment she stepped beyond the gate? Or was it always inside her, waiting for the exile to crack the earth of her soul wide enough for it to rise? She placed her hand just below her ribs. I felt nothing, yet I knew everything. This was not pain. This was a memory returning to form. Was this what the garden had planted in her? Not guilt, but a well. A sacred place where God once whispered and now only silence remained. No angel guarded this river. No flame protected its source. Only breath, only blood, only the fragile scaffolding of a woman who had carried more than one garden in her body, and still was not done. Was this why no one remembered her the way she truly was? Because to remember her would mean acknowledging that holiness had once worn skin, that exile had once held a child and did not break, that the first woman did not fall but survived. What is survival if not sacred? What is exile if not the path water takes when the ground no longer holds it? The river stirred, not in flood but in song. It sang without sound. A current beneath the world, beneath language, beneath even the breath that fogged the cold morning air. Eve did not know when she had begun walking, only that her feet moved not by will but by echo, as if following the memory of a path her body had once taken before it was called human. The soil was damp beneath her steps, and each footprint filled slowly with dew, not rain. She was being watched, not by angels, not by beasts, but by the very silence she carried. And still the river pulsed. She could feel it now in her spine, in her womb, in the scar between memory and forgetting. Not all rivers are made of water. Some are made of names. And hers, the name no longer spoken by the wind, rippled through that hidden current like the first syllable of a lost prayer. What name had the garden given her? Not Eve, not my mother, not a woman, but the sound the river made when it curved toward light for the first time. Has Adam heard it? Had he once spoken it in his sleep, then forgot? Or had that name been for her alone, a secret only water and fire could hold? She touched her throat, not to speak, but to feel the hollow where her first name had once lived. It was gone, but not lost, like the garden, like the gate, like the voice that had walked beside her in the evening. Gone, but not lost. She sat again beside the quiet, not to rest, but to remember what it felt like to be made of breath. And the river responded. It rose not through the earth but through her chest, a warmth without temperature, a movement without direction. Remember that I did not ask for permission, and she wept, not because she was sad, but because no one had ever told her that remembrance could be this holy. Could it be that the river was not a gift from the garden, but the garden's last breath, poured into her before the gates closed? whispered into her rib before she even stood. And if that were true, what was she now all these years later? A woman, a vessel, or a map of something heaven hoped would be rediscovered? The wind held its breath. The soil is still, and the river beneath her rib whispered again, not in words, but it aches. She rose slowly as if the earth itself were letting go of her, not with reluctance, but reverence. Her hands hung beside her like empty scrolls, not because they carried nothing, but because their story was no longer written in ink. It was written in the way she walked, the way her shadow touched the stones, the way her silence seemed to pull the light forward. Somewhere beneath her ribs the river flowed on, not in haste, but in rhythm. The rhythm of breath becomes form, of sorrow becoming a memory, of memory becoming seed. Was this what the garden meant to preserve? Not trees, not rules, but rhythm, the sacred cadence of being after exile. She walked past thorn and dust without flinching, not because they no longer cut her, but because she no longer bled the same. The child within her now still had become something else, not death, not sleeping, but echo. And in that echo she heard footsteps, old ones. From the garden's edge, from the day she turned back only once and saw no one behind her, who had walked with her, who had watched her cross the invisible line from innocence into burden. Had it been the one who made her, or the silence that followed him? And was there even a difference? Her feet carried her to a pool of still water, not a river, not a spring, just a mirror made of sky. She knelt beside it, not to drink, but to see. And there, for the first time since the exile, she looked upon her own face. Older, softer, wiser, but still hers, and she did not flinch, did not weep. She only whispered, "Is this the face you remembered when you breathed me into being?" The water rippled not from wind, but from the answer. And in the circle it made, she saw something move, not her reflection, but the shape of the river winding through the hollow place beneath her ribs, still flowing, still singing, still sacred. The water did not still, it breathed, as if it too had been waiting for her hands, for her voice, for her return. But this was not Eden, and she was not returning, she was remembering. There is a difference. Return longs for the past, but remembrance carries the past forward like fire in a cupped palm. She cupped her hands now, not to gather the water, but to feel its weightless presence pass through her fingers, and the river responded. Inside her, beneath bone and silence, the current grew louder, a hum that threaded through marrow, a vibration older than grief. She was no longer weeping, not because sorrow had left her, but because sorrow had become sacred, had become form, and form had become a question. If I was shaped by your breath, why did you let me walk so far without it? No answer came. Only the echo of her own voice circling back like the river that had no mouth and no source, only movement. And perhaps that was the answer, that divinity was not in the beginning but in the continuation, that to carry the river is holier than to find its source. She stood again, not tall, not proud, but rooted. The earth did not part for her. The sky did not weep. The fire did not descend, but something shifted, not in the world, in her. A stillness that felt like the last note of a song no one had ever sung aloud. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind them she saw a light. Not Eden, not the garden, but a single candle, lit, unmoving, placed inside her chest where memory used to ache. A flame that did not burn, only warmed, a holy warmth, like the kind that could cradle nations if they still believed in mothers. She touched her rib, and this time it did not ache. It pulsed like a heartbeat that remembered the garden without needing to return. Would the world ever know what she carried? Would they sing of the river beneath her rib? Would they honor the exile not as punishment, but as a passage? And would the children of her children remember the name the garden once gave her? The name that sounded like light on water, like wind in a cradle, like hope that had forgotten how to sleep. She breathed once more. And in that breath the river quieted. Not ended, not lost, only at peace. And in that silence, just before the morning, one final question drifted through the current of her soul. When night spreads her veil and the wind remembers only those names that were never spoken, stories become prayers, and prayers speak in the language only the soul can understand. This was never just Eve's story. It was the story of every soul who once touched a garden and has carried its memory ever since. If you ever feel alone, place your hand upon the earth and listen to the river beneath, the one that once flowed beneath a woman's rib. And if someone asks, where did the story go? Simply whisper, the story now walks in my memory. As you fall asleep, may the memory of Eve walk through your dreams like a breeze, and may you one day ask yourself, is there still a garden alive inside me? May your memories become light. Amen.